First, thank you, Jim, very much for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to be here today. I'm going to talk about some of the science of what I do, as well as some of what I think it might mean and where we're going. And it is behavioral ecology, and I am a plant ecologist or a botanist or whatever you want to say. And it's been a long progression over the last 20, 25 years since I was a grad student to be able to say certain things in public. So starting in my career, I couldn't use the word behavior in any plant study. We were just prevented in the literature. It was the sociopolitics of publishing. We couldn't use that word. We had to do something clunky, or plasticity, or adaptive plasticity. And eventually I got old enough that I stopped caring, and so I forced it through, as well as did others. And I'm going to talk about one of the reasons why we'll be able to make some of these changes in science. And I really want to emphasize that this intertwining of natural sciences and social sciences, philosophy, and English is critical to understanding. Throughout my career, there's times where we couldn't go forward in our science because the underlying philosophy was not known. And until there were advances in understanding, we didn't even know the questions to begin to ask. And as we and others make those steps forward, we're able to ask new questions and discover more. So I really do feel this field right now is limited by philosophy more than the ability to do natural science research, and I'll talk about that a little bit. This is a crest my grad student made, and just to give you some sense of what it's like up in Alberta, my wife studies grizzly bears, so my students made the plants crushing the skeleton of the grizzly bear. Anyway. I'm going to try to cover three main things. Briefly on being a plant, just some basic ideas from my perspective of current paradigms, but also where we might move to understanding what plants are. I'll talk a little bit about some of the actual research coming in my lab, a few example type studies, which I want to present to give you an understanding of why I feel comfortable talking about plant behavior based on the data rather than personal opinion, and a little bit about where this may lead to future understanding. So here's three classic scientific perspectives of what is a plant. And the first is, let's call this first one the Shakespearean idea. This is a plant a rose by any other name would smell so sweet. That's a trait-based understanding of what a plant is. There's a characteristic, and that describes what it is. So it is based on its morphology, its shared descent, its evolutionary perspectives. That's reasonable. Lots of good stuff comes with that. We do like to categorize. We do collect stamps, and it's the same idea of collecting biological stamps. The more dominant one in research, and certainly in Alberta and any commodity-based area, is that a plant is a factory. And so we can take this factory and we can build this factory. We put it in a location. We give it its supplies, and we get the products. And so the plant is just a factory which converts things into what people want. And so the whole foundation of modern plant physiology, agroforestry research is based on this idea of improvement. And improvement means not making a better organism, it means making a better factory. And if you're not in the research side in plants, you may not understand how much money there is in plant research. And that drives this point of focus. And so for the last 50 years at least, the dominant paradigm in plant biology, understanding plants, is this idea of how we get products from them. And we're beginning to show that this has been a problem to a broader understanding. But the conservation biologists aren't necessarily any better. And so from a conservation biologist, what is a plant? A plant is a natural factory that gives us ecological goods and services. It stores our carbon. Or it provides habitat for things people care about, like birds and grizzly bears and things like that. And so these are some of the dominant views of what a plant is, and these frame the questions that we all have historically asked. But we have a real problem, in that in a natural system, species do not interact with each other. Species are maybe not even real. That's just an artificial construct that we use based on a variety of reasons, but individuals are real. And individuals interact. Individuals interact with each other. Individuals interact with the natural world, with the resources, with their enemies, their friends. But our perspectives of what a plant is ignore the individuality of the organism. It's focused on the thing, but not as an individual thing. And so we could ask ourselves this question. Imagine we thought about dogs and cats in the absence of individuality. Would we have pets? Would we be able to relate to what they're doing? Would we even care? Or would we focus just totally on total population size and how many wild cats are there in Calgary? And the answer is a lot, by the way, for that one. And so we're asking, out of my lab, questions such as, can we understand the natural world without actually understanding the individuals who live in the natural world? Can we learn about nature without knowing who's in nature as individuals through their evolutionary histories and their having to deal with life's challenges? And so that's what my lab is moving more and more towards, is trying to understand what a plant is. And we're taking a very, we could say, an existential approach, is trying to understand what it does. Can we understand who it is based on what it's capable of and how it actually acts under certain conditions? And I am an experimental plant biologist, and that is the approach we're taking. We are taking a very traditional scientific approach to a very non-traditional set of questions. But we do have a little bit of history, and the original ideas always come back to Charles Darwin, and this is no exception here. His second to last book he wrote with his son Francis. It's on the power and movement in plants. Many people may not know, but The Origin of Species was 1859. Every book, more or less, after that he wrote were plants. And so once he got the easy stuff done, he then moved to plant biology. And in this book, he has a quote which is used a lot. You'll see this in a lot of places, because it really is a powerful quote. It is hardly an exaggeration to say that the tip of the radical, which is a part of the root, thus endowed with sensitivity and having the power of directing the movements of the adjoining parts, acts like the brain of one of the lower atoms. So even then he was recognizing there's something funny here. This little botanical bit of the plant was doing interesting things. In 1989, the first paper synthesizing the idea of plant behavior came forward with a definition. And then since then, and really in the last 10 years in particular, there started to be a lot of studies showing plants are doing weird stuff. They identify kin. They respond to kin differently than they respond to strangers. They're able to communicate within an individual, within a species, across taxa. There's resource sharing, defense strategies, basically anything you can think an organism should do in the context of natural selection, plants do. And I want to go through a couple examples. And I'm going to start with the sensitive plant. This is Mimosa pudica. It's in North America, its main habitat are undergraduate teaching labs. There are a couple wild species, related species in Florida that I've started working on, but it's a major weed throughout the subtropics. And it's called sensitive plant for obvious reasons. A touch and it closes. This closure is thought to be a defensive strategy, a way of hiding against leaf herbivores, caterpillars or deer or something. It has some other potential benefits. But I will say straight off, there's no field work on it. So we actually don't know if it is or isn't a defensive strategy. So that's something we're working on, but we're assuming it is. But this strategy has a couple costs. The first is once closing the leaves is free for the plant, but reopening them requires energy. So you can stay hidden, but you have to pay to come back open. And if you are hidden, you can't photosynthesize very well because you're hiding from the sun as much as you're hiding from the deer. And so there's cost to this rapid response. So we took a bit basic question of when should a plant hide? And we came up with basically two predictions. In animal behavior science, animals frequently accept more risk of being eaten if they're starving. So it doesn't matter if you're talking about dugongs and tiger sharks or squirrels and hawks. If they're starving, they'll go where the predators are if the food is there. That's a very traditional prediction, and there's a lot of evidence for that. And so if we see hiding as avoiding predation risk, we could ask, well, when might they hide longer? Well, plants starve under low light, so we might imagine taking the behavioral prediction that if a plant is very well fed, high light, it's going to hide. It doesn't need to take risk. But if the plant is starving, it's going to open up quickly. It has to feed. And so it turns out that this prediction that you'll have more rapid opening under low light comes from behavioral theory, But what I liked about this study is that plant physiologists actually had the exact opposite prediction. Because opening takes energy, they should open faster if under high light. So the reason I'm showing this example is this is one of the cases where your approach to understanding, physiological versus behavioral, results in a very different prediction that's testable. And so that's what we did. We created high-low light environments, and we simply asked how long do they hide. And we see a positive relationship here, meaning under high light, they actually opened slower. So the results we got out of here were directly consistent with behavioral theory and directly inconsistent with plant physiological understanding. And so this is one of the reasons we're moving this way, is just the physiologists just were right. But this is what happened, and this has been repeated by our labs and other species as well. And so we need a framework for understanding what we actually are seeing in these natural systems. What I want to talk about now, or actually, is the more bread and butter of my lab, which is roots. For a lot of reasons, I study roots, and we like to say what we do is we've just created rat mazes. I was actually not even a B+ student in undergraduate. I couldn't have gotten into the graduate program I now teach in. And so because I'm not particularly smart, I'm just reinventing 1950s psychology in my lab. So I don't have to have really new ideas, just new approaches. And so we've created rat mazes out of plexiglass so we can look at roots move over time. And we're asking questions related to where does a plant put its body in space? So where should it put its roots relative to the environment it lives in, which includes other roots as well as nutrients and enemies and these sorts of things. And we need to remember that roots have a multiple set of roles. One is the obvious structural, the plants have to stand up and they have to capture resources. But the other, coming back to that Darwin, is that those roots are sensory organs. So those roots are how they detect their environment. So it's more complicated than just a mouth. Making it even harder is an individual root plant might have tens of thousands or even millions root tips that are potentially interacting independently of each other, but they're integrated to the individual organism through natural selection. And so there's no theory dealing with this. Like, behavioral theory is actually fairly straightforward. You have one mouth in one body. Where the body moves, the mouth moves. And so the theories are based on that. There's no theory for what plants are doing, and that's part of also what we're trying to work on, is create a behavioral theory that allows for different ways of life. The obvious other problem is that dirt is dark, and so that makes working with roots a little more challenging. So a lot of what we do is develop new techniques. But let me explain some of the things that we're seeing. This one's, the framework we're coming from is optimal foraging theory. It's an old school theory in behavioral ecology that's still used. It's basically the idea that animals make foraging decisions generally consistent with fitness outcomes. So if you're looking for food, go to where the food is. Don't look for food where there is no food. A very basic idea. So that's what this is actually showing in plants. This line represents plants foraging randomly in the soil. Any point above that line means they tend to put their roots where there's nutrients relative to no nutrient soil. So most plant ever tested goes where the food is. Makes sense, evolution should favor that, but that actually is a behavior. Is that given choice in the environment, they go and they forage where the food is. So this is very, very common in plants. I want to talk about two other more complicated ideas though. One is a more dynamic approach, bringing back this concept of time. And the other one is asking the question of, can plants make foraging decisions when they're stressed? Or does stress disrupt their ability to make decisions, as it does in people? So, animal behavior theory says that a plant foraging in a no it doesn't. It says an animal foraging in a landscape will stop looking for food when it finds a good patch. This makes sense. You want to go drinking, so you go to the bar, you found a bar that has low line, you stay there. You don't go to the next one. We want to ask that question. Do plants stop looking once they found something? And so we created, again, some experimental mazes. We grew a plant either next to a high-quality patch or a low-quality patch or a uniform world. We did some things to look at roots, and we asked the question of how far away from the plant body do the roots go? When a plant grew next to a high-quality patch, its roots didn't go very far. When it grew next to a low-quality patch, its roots went way past the patch. It kept looking. So what we're seeing is once that plant found food, it stopped exploring. Again, exactly what animal biologists would have predicted. Plant biologists predict, again, the opposite. When you find resources, you have more resources available for more growth, so you should grow more. So the behaviorists predict what you should do based on finding the food in optimality. The plant physiologists have a different prediction. Again, this is just because they haven't asked the questions in this sort of way. So we're able to show different answers. One of the things we're working on now, and we're writing this up now, is this idea of stress. And so we view where to put your roots in the soil as a decision. We know the plants are capable of alternative outcomes, and so there is a decision-making process. We know in human psychology and most other aspects of animal behavior, stressful events disrupt the ability to make decisions. So we all probably know this from personal experience. Something bad happens, you don't want to be asked the hard questions for a few days or weeks or however long it is. So we wanted to ask the basic question, is that true for plants too? Can stress disrupt the ability to make decisions? So we're using this root foraging idea as our decision metric. And we had to create a new technique to look at this because these are short-term processes. And so I had lunch with an engineering friend and I said how hard it was to look at roots. He said, stop whining. And then he said, well, why would you look at roots? Why don't you just look at the soil? Because if the roots grow, the soil is moving. Why don't you just measure soil movement? So we developed a technique to do that. And this is actually a strain map of particles in the soil that have moved because of root growth. Areas of red means lots of root growth. Not red means not a lot of root growth. This is much more sensitive than the old school approach. So we took some sunflower plants, we stressed them out by cutting off some leaves, and asked, how does this impact making decisions? So this is our undamaged plants. The blue represents amount of root growth where the nutrients are. The green is the amount of root growth in a control area where there's just glass beads instead of nutrient beads. As expected, these plants make good decisions. They put their roots where the food is. When we stress them, we see something very, very different. So before the stress event, they were making good decisions. I don't have that here. As soon as we stressed them, they kept growing. But their growth was random with regard to where the food was and it wasn't food. After about 100 hours, they settled down and they started making good decisions again. And so what we're able to show here is this stressful event doesn't prevent them from making decisions in the long run, but it causes this transient shift where the growth happens, but it's not with regard to the external environment. Very consistent with what we're seeing from human psychology. Physiologists don't have a prediction for that. The last example, real fast, I know I'm running out of time here, is looking at how things interact. This is another species of plant grown in artificial rat mazes where we have nutrients in different patches in different places in the soil. The short for this plant is it ignores patches. It doesn't make good decisions. It doesn't keep its roots where the food is. We would expect this red bar to stop here. But there's something interesting going on, which is if we now put the plant in a homogeneous world with another neighbor, it stops growing roots. It avoids other plants. So it's highly responsive to other individuals, but less responsive to nutrients, unless you put both of those in together. So when we put them both in together, we actually get a new foraging strategy. It integrates the information of neighbors and nutrients, and it takes risk going where the food is in the presence of the neighbor, but if there's no reward, it avoids the neighbor. So its response to neighbors is contingent upon that risk-reward balance that we talked about before. So those are some examples of what we're doing in the lab, and we have lots and lots of this going on because, well, it's actually really easy because nobody's done it before. We don't have to be clever, we just have to be first. And what's nice is that plant growth we're seeing is actually pretty well predicted by animal-derived behavioral models. It actually seems to be not just a flashy framework, it might actually explain what plants do, which makes sense because those models actually weren't derived for animals. They were derived based on an assumption of a rational player. That rational player is natural selection. And that should work for plants as well as it does anything else. I agree with Kingsolver's quote that this issue of time probably is important. We've sort of forgotten about that in the context of plants. And that plants are integrating diverse types of information, which is interesting. So my lab, we're moving from this view of factories to individuals. We're beginning to look in an agricultural context, what happens if you let plants be plants instead of as factories? What if we could understand how they find their food and then modify our applications of nutrients accordingly? Can we be smarter in our nitrogen application so there's less waste, so there's less runoff, less cost, and more competition with the weeds? And then, again, we're working on the philosophical understanding and trying to figure out what plants are capable of. Finally, I do want to end with an acknowledgement. This is a process of a lot of people, but the biggest ones I really want to thank are the funding agencies. This is a weird area of science, and as on principle, my lab doesn't take any industrial funding. So I do this all from federal agencies and conservation groups. And with that, that means I take your money. So as taxpayers, I want to thank you for allowing me to ask the questions that we do in the lab. Thank you very much.
That was terrific. I'll let you run off in a second. We're going to head to a break in about a few minutes after we have a quick chat. But first of all, my first question, just an observation. Plants actually sound a lot like my teenage son.
Well, my teenage sons make very few good decisions, stressed or unstressed.
No, my first legitimate and real question, I think that excellent presentation, and I think it's very clear and probably jumping off the top of most people's heads here. Why do you hate plant physiologists so much?
I have no, there are individual plant physiologists I'm not fond of, but as a discipline, it's just that they've forgotten to ask some questions. And so what they have is very good for a very narrow set of understanding of how plants live, a very functional reductionist approach. And they've gotten so much money for so long, they should have asked these other questions. So, not hate, just opportunity.
What keeps you up at night? What is that vexing question that it just feels a little bit out of reach that you and your colleagues are working to right now? I know there's a bunch of them.
I want to know what it is to be a plant. That's the core principle. And one of the approaches I'm working on is I'm trying to develop a hierarchical understanding of decision making in plants. And so can we basically make a brain map of what is high and low priority in the context of a plant's life?
Ladies and gentlemen, J.C. Cahill.